Hello and welcome to the last video of your Gospel of Mark series. We pick up today in chapter 14, which is Thursday of Holy Week. It is the scene of what has come to be known as the Last Supper. And you might want to reference that famous painting by Leonardo da Vinci with Jesus in the center and all 12 of his disciples around him at the dinner table. This is a Passover meal. As you can see in verse 12, it says when they killed the Passover. And so you should probably do a quick review of what the Passover is, what it signified, and what they ate during the Passover. The most significant parts of the meal in this particular scene would be the bread and the wine, which, as most of you who've ever attended a church know, take on a new symbolic significance here. As Jesus passes around the bread and the wine at this Passover meal, he says to eat the bread as if it's his body and drink the wine as if it's his blood, which is kind of gruesome and horrifying until you remember what we learned last semester about blood being a core part of a covenant. And he is essentially establishing a new covenant with them. So if you're reading all the footnotes, you'll see that covenant is another word for testament here. This is the blood of the New Testament. Of course, this is where the phrase New Testament, the 27 books of the New Testament, comes from. A testament is to testify to something, which in this case means the same thing as making a covenant, making a promise. This continues that Old Testament motif of sacrifices. And we've read lots of episodes of sacrifice, of course, the Passover being one of the most significant ones. And here, Jesus is basically setting himself up as the last sacrifice. If the Son of God lays down his life as a sacrifice, then basically you don't need to do any more sacrifices because that's the most ultimate sacrifice that you can get. So he's foreshadowing his death and bringing some symbolism, some covenant symbolism to the meal so that every time they continue to eat the meal, and it will continue to be annual, of course in a lot of churches it's weekly or monthly, there's a memory of Jesus and the new covenant and the final sacrifice. So after dinner, they all go to the Garden of Gethsemane. It's very late at night, and this is apparently where Jesus likes to go to be alone and have solitude and do his praying. So let's look a little more closely at his prayer. He says to God the Father, "Take away this cup from me. All things are possible unto thee. Nevertheless, not what I will, but what thou wilt." Again, more symbolism. What it means here is God the Father is handing him a cup to drink from. It's like instructions. This is what you need to do next. And so he asks God, please take the cup away. Don't make me do it. Jesus knows he's about to be killed the next day. And Son of God or not, he's got to suffer like a human being, and he doesn't want to do it. So he cries to his Father, please don't make me. Nevertheless, not what I will, but what thou wilt. And God is silent. God the Father is silent, so he knows that he has to go through with it. So after the prayer, he goes back to his disciples, and this is where Judas betrays him and he gets arrested. So let's explain a little bit about why that happens. So we've seen how he angers the establishment, the Pharisees, the scribes, the high priests. And now that he's in Jerusalem, he has angered the highest of the priests, the chief priests of the entire region, of the entire religion. And they've decided that they want to get him and get him out of the way. So they need to be able to arrest him, but they have to be very careful because he's extremely popular with the people. And we know this because of the way he was greeted at the gates of Jerusalem just a few days before. He's got a huge following. We've seen him feed crowds of 4,000 and 5,000 people. So the high priests have to be super careful about arresting someone so popular. So they need to do it at night. And in order to get him at night, they have to know where he hangs out, who he hangs out with, and once they get there, they have to know which one he is. And they wouldn't know because this is pre-newspaper, pre-media, so they don't know which guy he is. The only way to do this is to have some sort of contact with his inner circle, and this is where Judas comes in. Judas has already offered, as you read on the previous page, to give Jesus up, to point out who he is, to let the high priest know where he's going to be and which one he is in return for money. So the high priests send their guards their soldiers to the appointed place, and Judas points out which guy Jesus is with a kiss. Now, as far as the kiss goes, kind of think the European kiss on either cheek. It's just a cultural greeting. And so we've got a lot of irony here. A kiss is supposed to be something warm and friendly and loving, but in this case, it is what has come to be known as a kiss of death. And so this is how Jesus gets grabbed by the bad guys and hauled off to the chief priest's palace. So while he's in the palace in the middle of the night, this is the first trial. And you may have noticed that he actually undergoes 2 different trials, and here's why. The people who want him killed are the religious leaders, primarily. And yet the religious leaders aren't the ones with the power to execute. The only people with the power to execute would be the Romans. So he has to have 2 trials. The first one is the religious one, the Jewish one. It has to be sneaky. It has to be in the middle of the night. So he put him on trial in the middle of the night for blasphemy. This is a word that we talked about a couple of days ago. Make sure you're familiar with what that is. They corner him and ask him if he is the Christ and the Son of the Blessed. And Jesus says, yes, I am. I'm the Messiah. I'm the Son of God. And to them, that's blasphemy because they don't believe that it's true. Primarily because he's not really behaving the way they expect a Messiah to behave. He's not defeating the Romans. He's not winning anything in an obvious way. So they don't like him for all these reasons. They convict him of blasphemy. And so the next morning, they basically have to take him to the Roman authorities so that the Romans can kill him. So they bring him to Pontius Pilate. Pontius Pilate is the Roman authority. He's like the governor or a magistrate, like combination governor and judge. And they put Jesus on trial. And Pilate, I want you to notice, doesn't seem to really care that much. He doesn't understand why they want to kill Jesus. As far as he can tell, he's just a really popular preacher. So he kind of gives them an out, says, why don't I just let him go free? It's kind of a favor during Passover. Apparently he does this every year to stay popular with the people. He gives them a prisoner, lets a prisoner go free as sort of a Passover gift. And they say, nope, we'd rather have Barabbas go free. And Barabbas is a murderer. So the people have really changed their mind very, very quickly about liking versus disliking Jesus. And it's because the priests got out in the crowd and kind of riled them up. And so Pilate feels sort of cornered. He said, okay, if that's what you want. Basically, all Pilate wants to do is to keep the peace, particularly during the Passover when there's so many extra thousands of people around. He cannot afford to have the people angry. He can't afford a riot. He can't afford to lose control in the area that he's in charge of. So he sentences Jesus to death. And of course, as you've learned in your history class, crucifixion is one of the primary methods of Roman execution because it's very public. And the body dies and then hangs dead up on this very high public post so that anybody walking by can say, that's what happens to anybody who defies the Romans. So they take him to Golgotha, which it says in the text means the place of the skulls, because the dead bodies had to stay on the crosses. That was the whole point of crucifixion. Not only was it painful, but it was public, and it lingered. It was like a billboard. And so the body would stay there, and it would rot, and it would fall off, and it would decompose. And so the entire area around this crucifixion zone was covered in skulls. And so this is where they take Jesus to kill him. The next kind of interesting thing that happens are the final words that Jesus says while he is on the cross dying. He says, and in the text that you read, it gives you the Hebrew, Eloi, Eloi, lama sabachthani, and I probably said that wrong because I don't know Hebrew, but I do know what that means in English, and it means, my God, why hast thou forsaken me? So let's talk about those lines for a few minutes. Those are really, really significant lines. On the surface, it just indicates that Jesus is not only in physical pain, but he's in emotional pain, and he feels like God, his Father, has abandoned him. We saw him pray the night before, please don't make me do this. And then God doesn't say anything back. And so he has to go through with it. And now he feels completely abandoned and alone and dying. So that's the obvious surface level meaning. But other than that, there's something else really significant going on. And that is, he's actually quoting from the Psalms here. Honors classes, you've already read and studied Psalms 22. Everybody else, Psalms 22 begins, my God, why hast you forsaken me? And it's a poem that had been written 2,000 years before Jesus by King David. And King David was in a situation not quite as bad as Jesus, but he was in a painful situation where he felt like he had a lot of enemies and God wasn't helping him out. And so in the poem, he cries out to God in pain. He says, I keep crying to you and you keep not answering me. I feel terrible. I'm miserable. Everybody hates me. When are you going to help? And then in the second half of the poem, he remembers very specifically how God had always come through in the past for his ancestors, like Abraham and Isaac and Jacob and Moses. And he even mentions some of those characters. And the poem ends with this great statement of faith that basically says, I trust you as God. You saved my ancestors in the past. I know that you can save me now. And I believe that you're going to keep your promises and that everything's going to be okay in the future. So when Jesus, dying on the cross, who barely has any strength left in him, manages to croak out this one line of poetry, the Jews standing around know exactly what he means because they know this poem. It would be very similar to me saying something like, just out of the blue, if I were to say, 'twas the night before Christmas and all through the house, and then stop right there. In your head, you're thinking, not a creature was stirring, not even a mouse, and you know the rest of the poem. You know the whole thing. You know it's about Santa Claus, and you know that at the end he leaves the presents and then he flies away with his reindeer. But all I had to do was quote this really super familiar opening line of the poem, and you know what I mean. Same thing here with Jesus. So he quotes this one line that just sounds like it's nothing but agony, and indeed it is agony. But behind the agony is a greater meaning, which is you can trust God. He's always saved our people before. Everything's going to be okay now, and everything is going to be okay in the future. When Jesus finally does die, it says that darkness falls over the whole land. It also says that the veil of the temple is torn in half from the top to the bottom. So just a quick little note about the temple. The temple has different zones, and the farthest back zone is called the Holy of Holies, and only the high priest is allowed back there, and there's a curtain that separates it from the rest of the temple. The text says that that curtain rips from the top to the bottom, which means that God ripped it. If mankind had ripped it, then it would have gone from the bottom to the top. But this is a top to bottom rip, which means that God has now ripped apart the separation between him and purity and holiness and goodness and perfection. And it's an open passageway now between mankind and him. And that kind of goes back to what we keep saying about Jesus as something of an everyman, an access for everybody, and a kingdom that's at hand and that everybody has access to. So Jesus dies, and the custom, as you know, is for his body just to stay there and rot. But the people that follow him obviously do not want that to happen. And fortunately, there's one Jesus follower named Joseph of Arimathea. This is on page 213. We're in chapter 15 now. And he is wealthy, and he is Roman, and he knows Pilate. So he goes to Pilate and says, can I please take this body down? And Pilate lets him, because again, Pilate never really cared about Jesus to begin with. So they take his body down and they rush it to a tomb, which was owned by Joseph of Arimathea. He's a wealthy guy. He has enough money to own a tomb, and a tomb would have to be stone, made out of stone, and it could have been a cave with a boulder. It could have been something more like a mausoleum, but at any rate, it has a stone gate, sort of, stone door that would be a big circle so you can roll it. Otherwise, you wouldn't be able to move a big stone door. And this is important If you can imagine a mausoleum, the reason why they are sealed shut is because dead bodies go inside and they wouldn't smell good. So they have to rush. They have to rush really fast to get Jesus's body into the tomb because this is Friday. Of course, in Holy Week, it's what's known as Good Friday, which is another little bit of irony. It's a good thing, but it's a very painful, sad day. But what comes right after Friday? Saturday, the Sabbath. And in Jewish custom, the Sabbath starts at sundown. And Jesus didn't die until very, very late in the afternoon. So they have to hurry because you're not allowed to work on the Sabbath. So they have just enough time to take him down, wrap him in linen, like you would imagine a mummy. It's the shrouding of the corpse, which it happens in many cultures. And they take him and they get him in the tomb, which was hewn or carved out of a rock, and they roll the stone over the door of the grave and they leave him there. Then comes Saturday, the Sabbath, where they're not allowed to do anything. And the story doesn't really tell us anything that happens on Saturday, the Sabbath. We have to imagine that everybody is dumbfounded and confused because the Messiah was supposed to be a king. He was supposed to be a political, military leader. He was supposed to save his people, which means save the Jews from their oppressors, the Romans. And instead, this guy, who was supposed to be the Messiah, has just been executed by the Romans. And so it doesn't make sense. So they're probably asking themselves, were we wrong? Have we gotten all of this wrong all the time? So it's not only sad and miserable, but it's confusing. As the sun rises on Sunday, that signifies the end of the Sabbath. And so that's when people can work again. So the women get up before the sunrise, probably so that they can get into the graveyard undetected, because it's dangerous to announce yourself publicly as a friend of someone who was just executed. And they, Mary Magdalene, Mary the mother of James, and a woman named Salome, that says they bring sweet spices that they might come and anoint him. And we know what anointing is, but in this case, it's what you would do to a dead body. And it's, again, part of Hebrew custom. It has to do with preserving the body and treating the body with honor. And so they didn't have time to do this on Friday night before Sabbath started. So they basically have to finish their Jewish customs surrounding death. So they show up to take care of the body, and as they go in, they, of course, see that the stone is already rolled away. The door's open. And when they go in, they see a young man sitting on the right side, clothed in a long white garment. This would indicate an angel. And the angel says, "Don't be afraid. Jesus is risen. He's not here. And go tell everybody that this happened." Here's a really interesting side note. In this culture, women are worse than second class. Women have no rights. Women wouldn't have even been trusted to testify in court. The word of a woman really meant basically nothing. So the fact that it's 3 women that discover the resurrection first and go back to tell everybody really, I think, has a lot of implications for this everyman, everybody, men and women equally, rich and poor equally, Romans and Jews equally. Everybody has access to this story. So the women go back and they tell everyone what happens. It's met with some doubt, but we find out on the last page that Jesus does make some other appearances in his kind of resurrected sort of spiritual form. And at this time, he's able to tell his followers to go ye into all the world and preach the gospel to every creature. Preach the gospel means preach the good news. And the good news is that the Messiah came, that the Son of God came to man, that the curtain was ripped, that everybody now has access to God, that you don't have to do sacrifices anymore, that everything's going to be fine. Different churches are going to interpret the specifics of what the gospel means in slightly different ways. Different churches and denominations and so forth are going to have different ideas for how you become an official follower, for how you get official salvation. But one final note about this last page of the text, these last 20 verses. They're actually a little bit controversial, and I'm going to give you just a few ideas in closing here about biblical interpretation. We've already talked about how old the texts are, but how certain we are, to a pretty decent degree, that what we have right now is accurate to the original copies because of the tremendously accurate copying traditions that the Jews had, and because we have some old copies that are virtually identical to later copies, which proves that their copying tradition was really strict and really accurate. However, certain manuscripts that we have still have differences. Something that dates back 2,000 years ago and something that dates back 1,000 years ago sometimes do have some differences. And this last page of the text is one of them. These last 20 verses appear in some of the ancient manuscripts, but they're not there in some of the other manuscripts. So the theory is that along the way, at some point, a scribe may have added in these last 20 verses to give the story some closure. If you turn back one page and see that the story may have ended, that the women went out quickly and they were afraid, end of story, that is not a particularly satisfying end of the story. So these other pieces could have been added later. Without a time machine, we don't really know exactly who wrote those 20 verses and when, and why we have them in some manuscripts and not in others. That concludes our lessons on Mark. Coming up will be a lesson on Christ symbolism. We'll also talk a little bit about Bible motifs, and we'll do a quick day on Revelation to finish up the New Testament next week. And that is all.